Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Good evening from Westminster, where we're just hours away from a momentous vote in Parliament that could see MPs take charge and try to force the Prime Minister to ask for another delay to Brexit. Rebel Conservatives will join forces with the opposition as they attempt to block a no-deal Brexit. Downing Street says if the government loses tonight, they'll seek a snap election next month. The mood inside the House of Commons has been febrile this afternoon. The government's working majority has been slashed to zero before the debate even gets underway, after Tory MP Dr. Philip Lee crossed the floor and defected to the Liberal Democrats. Tories who defy the government in the next few hours know that they could face expulsion from their party and deselection as MPs. Our first report tonight is from our political editor, Laura Kuensberg.
A new era. The former goodies in government have become baddies for number 10.
Let's go and have this conversation, and I'm very interested to hear what he has to say.
Former cabinet ministers on their way to oppose the Prime Minister, who's trying to win them round.
All Brexit deals on that. All Brexit deals on that.
The clamour from Tory rebels is not to stay in the EU. Most of them voted for the old government's exit deal that failed. But they will do all they can not to remain, but to block Boris Johnson leaving without a deal. It's only the second time he's made this journey as Prime Minister, screaming down Whitehall into the gates of Parliament. There were only a few murmurs when he took his place, and he was mocked when talking about the British tradition of democracy.
This country still stands then as now for democracy, for the rule of law.
Then less than 2 minutes in, watch this. The three MPs walking through the chamber are two Lib Dems flanking a Conservative, Philip Lee, who turns right with them to take a new seat alongside that rival party. A defection that takes away Boris Johnson's majority altogether.
I wish I might, honourable friend, all the best.
So can he really hold off MPs on all sides who want to block no deal, which could mean an extra 3-month wait for Brexit?
There is only one way, Mr. Speaker, to describe this deal. It is Jeremy Corbyn's surrender bill. That's what it is. It means running up. It means running up the white flag. The bill's shameful. There are no circumstances in which I will ever accept anything like it.
The characters might be different, but look who might just be enjoying this a little. Just like his predecessor, many of the Prime Minister's powerful foes are sitting on the benches behind him.
Many of us are concerned that we are currently on course to leaving the European Union without a deal on the 31st of October, that we won't have time to negotiate and legislate for a new deal.
Could the Prime Minister now make a commitment to publish this afternoon the UK's proposals, so that those of us who are considering what to do later today can have had the benefit of seeing them?
This new tribe of Tory rebels is determined to work alongside Labour.
Jeremy Corbyn!
To find a way to block no deal.
He isn't winning friends in Europe, he's losing friends at home. His is a government with no mandate, no morals, and as of today, no majority.
Careful plans for beating the government tonight have been hatched with Tory rebels, Labour and the smaller parties too.
This is a massively important day. All of us are united across the opposition parties. This is about stopping the threat of no deal.
As things stand, you are confident you will manage to take control of the Commons tonight?
Yes, I am, because this is about parliamentarians doing their job across party.
How much do the next 12 hours matter?
They matter immensely. Our job here and now, whatever our future aspirations are, is to get the legislation that ensures that we do not leave at the end of October with a no-deal Brexit.
It may be tight and it is fluid, but right now it seems MPs in here are on course to beat Boris Johnson tonight in the first ever vote with him as Prime Minister. It would give them control of the House of Commons tomorrow to start to change the law to prevent the possibility of leaving the European Union without a formal deal in place. But it's the Prime Minister's willingness to do just that that saw him chosen for number 10.
So those devoted to Brexit who sent Mr Johnson there are firmly on board.
We're all filled with anxiety of various kinds. I know I am. This seems likely to be a day when certain senior members of Parliament lose the whip. You can't vote to take away the power of the government to govern and still remain a Conservative. So it's a very difficult day for everybody.
He's going into bat on behalf of the United Kingdom with the European Union, and there are people in this building who are trying to kick the stool from underneath him. We have to resist that.
In normal times, losing a majority means everything for our government. But now, that might not even be the most important thing that happens today.
And Laura is with me now. A knife-edge moment for the new Prime Minister, for Parliament, for the country, and who knows where this is going to end.
That's right, Sophie. And Boris Johnson has hardly been in the job for very long at all, and he's already played some very dramatic cards in quick succession. You know, in less than a week, he has cut the number of days that Parliament will have to sit, suspending them, giving them less time to talk about Brexit. He said that Tory MPs who vote against the government tonight will be chucked out of their jobs. They won't be allowed to stand for the Tory party again. And even now, Downing Street's making clear that if they lose this vote to rebels tonight, they'll try their very hardest to call a general election. So these are enormous threats and enormous stakes for Boris Johnson and everybody in that building behind me. It seems right now, with still some arm twisting going on behind the scenes, that the government is set to lose. And that does mean it's most likely by midnight we'll be in a tussle between Parliament and the Prime Minister over whether or not there should be a general election. But it seems whether that happens now or not, we are just finding ourselves very rapidly in the middle of a full throttle confrontation between Parliament that does not want to allow the country to leave the European Union without a formal deal, and a Prime Minister who secured his place in power, promising that he would always keep that as an option. And both of them cannot be the victors here, and they're both determined to win.
Laura Greensberg, thank you. So what could tonight's vote in the House of Commons mean for Britain's departure from the European Union, and how might the outcome lead to a general election next month? Our deputy political editor, John Pienaar, has been looking at the possible implications.
People often see Parliament as the place our politicians play political games. Well, forget that. Tonight, tomorrow, it's a fight that'll shape British politics and all our future for years, maybe generations. A battle between parties, within parties, and no neutrals. Not even the Speaker, John Bercow, who's made it his mission to see the Commons, not just the government, has a say and get its way, even if that means rewriting the rules that he's there to referee. So tonight's big vote is about giving MPs and later peers the chance to pass a law to block a no-deal Brexit and force Boris Johnson's government to seek and accept another delay to Brexit, past October the 31st, maybe till next January. He's warned Conservatives who rebel and vote for that they'd be kicked out of the parliamentary party, banned from standing as Tory candidates. A purge is what it's been called, and the PM's counter-move? The huge gamble of trying to call a snap election, maybe as soon as October the 14th, on a choice he believes he'd win, for Brexit with or without an EU deal, or against. But would the Commons allow a snap election on Boris Johnson's terms? Could MPs stop it happening? Because many would try. Well, a lot depends on Jeremy Corbyn. He's been saying almost daily, bring on the election. But many on Labour's side have been insisting that stopping a no-deal Brexit must come first, before an election, before a new referendum that some of them want. But either way, it takes 2/3 of the Commons, 434 MPs, to agree an early election. Mr Corbyn's opposition could stop it going ahead, unless the government finds another way. So what about the EU? What'll they make of it? Well, the next EU Leaders Summit is on October the 17th. Who'd be there for Britain if a snap election comes first? A Labour PM offering another referendum, or a re-elected Tory with a new mandate, wanting a better deal or to leave without one? If there's no election, well, there's still no clear sign of EU leaders like President Macron of France or Angela Merkel of Germany dropping their demand that the EU's single market must be protected as they see it after Brexit. Now, that means some controls covering the Irish border. Unless there's a compromise on that, we could leave with no deal. High stakes? They could hardly be any higher. The Prime Minister's been described as bringing new focus, new determination to Brexit. Hard to disagree with that, though he's also accelerated Britain's journey towards new risks. Critics say new dangers, and whatever happens, towards political splits and public recriminations of a kind no one has seen before.
John Pienaar there. Well, the government isn't just facing a fight from MPs. There are 2 legal challenges underway as well. And today the judge hearing a challenge to Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament was told that the plan was approved as early as mid-August, almost 2 weeks before it was made public. The claim was made in the Court of Session in Edinburgh, where MPs and peers are trying to block prorogation, the suspension of Parliament. And Lorna Gordon was in court. Lorna.
Yes, Sophie. The court was told that the Prime Minister had declined a request to submit a statement to court here under oath, but documents were submitted by government lawyers which appeared to show that Boris Johnson approved those plans to prorogue, to suspend Parliament, as you said, way back in the middle of August. That was before Downing Street aides publicly denied planning such a move. Now, the lawyers representing the cross-party group of parliamentarians who brought this action to court said that the government was showing breathtaking contempt for the Constitution and likened their actions to autocratic rule.
We have a Prime Minister who is seeking to hold office without accountability. It would seem the better to use power without responsibility. That is not a situation which this court can permit.
Well, the lawyer for the government said the arguments being made were academic, as it was not for the courts to decide if Parliament can be prorogued. These are, he said, political issues, political questions, and their resolution must be found in the political arena. Well, the judge here at the Court of Session, Lord Doherty, said he will attempt to make a decision overnight and reach a ruling tomorrow morning. Whatever that decision is, it is likely to be appealed.
Lorna, thank you. Well, this is the scene outside Parliament right now. As you can see, people, predominantly those against Brexit, have been gathering to vent their views. Our special correspondent, Lucy Manning, has been getting a flavour of the mood here.
MPs are back. The protesters hardly went away. From Yorkshire, Remain supporters came to insist Parliament does its job and isn't suspended so it can block a no-deal Brexit.
Why have you come down from Yorkshire today?
To stop the immoral and ridiculous nature of Boris Johnson, with the audacity to think that he can just take control of the House and tell all the MPs to go home for 5 weeks when this is the most important time in our political history.
It's now time for Parliament to take back control and put legislation in place to delay Brexit.
So are you happy for the rebels to take control of Parliament, what might be, some are saying, a constitutional outrage?
Do you not think proroguing Parliament at this critical time isn't a constitutional outrage? These people aren't rebels. They are stalwarts of the Conservative Party.
It's the Remain protesters who are out in force today because the tables have turned. They are now the ones who are angrier about the proposals coming out of Downing Street and what may now happen in Parliament.
Both sides know these are decisive days. The Brexiteers wary of MPs trying to delay it.
What about the MPs, the so-called rebel MPs?
They'll deselect them.
Do you think it's right?
Absolutely. Of course it is. You're going against democracy. You had a referendum.
They don't understand. They're talking about a coup d'etat. I haven't seen any tanks on the lawn.
The decisions they make inside will affect everyone out here and beyond. And with a possible election, it won't just be those on the streets who'll have their say. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
With Philip Lee's defection to the Lib Dems and the expected vote later, MPs have returned from their summer break straight into a defining moment for Brexit. They will vote this evening on whether to seize control of the parliamentary agenda from the government. If they win, Tory rebels and other parties could then introduce a law to force a Brexit extension. In theory, that would stop us leaving without a deal at the end of October. Boris Johnson has said that will result in his calling a general election. But to achieve that, he needs 2/3 of MPs to vote for one. If the opposition supports him in seeking an election, it would take place on October the 14th. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is right here. Gary, what's going on right now?
Right now, convention is being not just strained, but bust in the House of Commons. A lot of focus on what Boris Johnson was up to, people saying he was straining convention. It's actually being reinvented in there right now because MPs are trying to, opposition party MPs combined with Tory rebels, to wrest away from the government the timetable in order to pass a bill which would force Boris Johnson to ask for an extension, a 3-month extension to the Brexit date from the EU. And on top of that, potentially, maybe even a longer extension if the EU asked for it and Parliament approved it. There isn't any precedent for what's going on in there. And if it works, this wheeze, and this is the first stage of it tonight, and then if they win, they move to actually trying to pass a bill. If it works, Boris Johnson says, no, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm going to call an election. But it's not quite up to him to call an election. And one of the great questions going around today is what will Labour do if he asks them to help him, as he's required by law, to get that election? Will they back him and allow an early election? They haven't quite decided on that. The other thing that's buzzing around today, because Boris Johnson's been trying to pull over at the last minute Tory rebels by saying to them, don't do anything now, you'll spoil the delicate negotiations which are making really quite important progress in Brussels. A story in the Daily Telegraph emerged suggesting that the Prime Minister's chief aide, Dominic Cummings, had said the negotiations going on in Brussels were a sham. Number 10 saying that's not true. I've heard that one of the other things that might suggest that, in fact, those negotiations aren't exactly at full pelt is that there's been a diaspora of the negotiating team that was doing all that work, and they're now peppered all over Whitehall. Hardly any of them are still actually in the core team working on any of this. Boris Johnson eyeballs people in number 10 and tells them he thinks there's a 50-50 chance, maybe even slightly better, of a breakthrough. But an awful lot of those rebels are taking some convincing, and I don't think are going to come round. He may lose this extraordinary vote tonight, a moment in the Tory split, but also a moment in the convulsion of our politics, which I suspect children, grandchildren will be studying in history books in years to come.
This is your last chance to avoid a no-deal crash-out from the EU. That was the message from opposition parties backing the bill tonight, and from Tory rebel organisers too.
Do you still plan to vote against the government tonight? That's my plan, to vote for the bill.
The least likely of rebels, the former Chancellor, alongside other former ministers, back to the cabinet table they sat round in office 6 weeks ago, returning as ex-ministers to be told if they back the bill tonight designed to block a no-deal Brexit, they will no longer be Conservative MPs. Boris Johnson told Philip Hammond, "I won't tolerate a bill that hands over power to Corbyn." Philip Hammond responded, "We are handing over power to Parliament." Boris Johnson replied, "You're handing over power to a junta that includes Corbyn." The Prime Minister's chief aide, Dominic Cummings, accompanied him to the Commons. His strategy seems to guide the Prime Minister's every major move in office, including election timing and party discipline.
Thank you very much.
As the Prime Minister stood to make only his second Commons statement since moving into number 10, with acute timing, one Tory MP chose that moment to cross the floor. Boris Johnson spotted him going to sit with the Liberal Democrats, thereby wiping out the Tories' working majority of one.
I wish my honourable friend all the best.
The Prime Minister brushed it off before attacking the bill proposed by his opponents, which would require him to request a 3-month delay to the Brexit date, and maybe a much longer one if the EU demands it and MPs back that demand.
There is only one way, Mr. Speaker, to describe this deal. It is Jeremy Corbyn's surrender bill. That's what it is. It means running up. It means running up the white flag. The bill's shameful. It means running up. It means running up the white flag.
I condemn the rhetoric the Prime Minister used when he talked about a surrender bill. I hope he will reflect on his use of language. I really do hope he will reflect on his use of language. He isn't winning friends in Europe. He's losing friends at home. His is a government with no mandate, no morals, and as of today, no majority.
As the band played on outside, the Prime Minister was repeatedly asked about a report from his old employer, the pro-Brexit Daily Telegraph, which said his claim that negotiations with Brussels might yet bear fruit was fiction, and that his own chief aide had described the negotiations for a deal as a sham. One former cabinet minister asked him about that directly.
Are those reports accurate?
Mr. Speaker, I don't comment on leaks. He asked me exactly the same question this morning. We are working for a deal, and I believe we will get a deal.
Could the Prime Minister confirm that Dominic Cummings described the renegotiations as a sham?
I have to say that I saw this, as I say, I saw the story on the front of the Telegraph this morning. It seemed to be wholly implausible.
The Prime Minister's extraordinary knockabout performance today merely confirms, it seems to me, his obvious strategy, which is to set conditions which make no deal inevitable, to make sure that as much blame as possible is attached to the EU and to this House for that consequence, and then as quickly as he can fight a flag-waving general election before the consequences of no deal become too obvious to the public.
I don't want an election. I don't want an election. We don't want an election. I don't think he wants an election, Mr. Speaker, by the way, as far as I can make it out. We don't want an election. We want to get the deal done.
Watching him under attack from fellow Tories, his predecessor. The new Prime Minister is presiding over the Conservative split Theresa May strained in vain for 2 years to prevent. Tonight, number 10 threatening Tories they will be deselected if they vote against the government.
There's a lot of people around saying it's come to something when the Conservative Party is thinking of throwing out Sir Nicholas Soames. 37 years in the party, Churchill's grandson.
I'm as liable to be thrown out as the next man. But I just want to do.
You never thought this moment would come.
No, but I honestly, Gary, I know it's a sort of pathetic thing to say. I really, really want to do the right thing, and I'm not really worried about the consequences one way or the other.
Will you have a tear in your eye if you're thrown out of the party later today, or do you think the party's moved in a direction where you don't feel emotionally attached anymore?
I don't feel particularly attached to a party which is being led by Boris Johnson. I don't think he's fit for the office that he holds, and he is turning the Conservative Party into a form of English national party.
Some of those keeping the whip and voting with the government seemed no less gloomy.
With what spirit do you go through the lobbies with Boris Johnson tonight?
The spirit of sort of, resignation, really. There comes a point where you have to sort of bow to the inevitable.
You feel you've run out of options?
I think that sums it up perfectly well. I think we have run out of options.
And maybe it'll have to be no deal, even though you think that we could pay a heavy price for that?
That's possibly a likely outcome.
Do you think history will judge that vote kindly?
No. But everybody's boxed in.
Labour is wrestling with what it'll do if the bill taking control of the Brexit process off the government passes. Boris Johnson says he'll ask them to vote with him for a general election next month.
I'm intelligent enough to be able to say both things. I think this government is terrible and doing terrible things, but allowing them to play the game with their own rules will do even worse things to people they've already harmed, and I can't be involved with that.
Labour is saying it wants certainty about no deal and election dates before it does anything. But in an age of desperate tactics and strained conventions, certainty is in short supply.
Well, the Liberal Democrats' newest recruit, Philip Lee, joins me, as does Gitto Bebb, who's among the Conservative MPs who are planning to rebel tonight. Philip Lee, you'd obviously been thinking about this for some time. What was the final straw?
It's been a few months. I've sort of felt like the party I joined in 1992 was not the party that I was in, and that's why I've made the decision I've done today. It's been difficult, but it's a positive decision because I passionately believe that Liberal Democrats promise a brighter future for my country.
And what were you thinking as you sat there across the aisle from Boris Johnson, listening to your one-time colleague?
Well, it's quite odd. I mean, I was looking at, Gitto was there, and I was just thinking, okay, this is a bit odd. I'm looking at colleagues who were colleagues up until just recently, and it's not easy. It's human. This place is a human endeavour. But listening to the Prime Minister, listening to his obfuscation, his bluster and all the other stuff today, I thought I've made the right decision here.
Well, the debate that aims to take control of the parliamentary timetable has just begun. In fact, let's hear a little bit of Oliver Letwin as he laid out his stall.
To offer a threat which actually harms us many times more than those against whom the threat is supposedly levelled is not, as I say, a credible negotiating strategy in my view.
Look, how confident are you both that this is going to work?
Well, I think I'm confident. I mean, I'm confident that there are enough people in the House who want to see a mechanism to stop no deal. I defer to Gitto on the numbers, but I think that there's a mechanism here that Parliament can assert itself and stop doing something which is going to undeniably be bad news for my constituency.
And how confident are you on those numbers?
Well, in terms of the Conservative numbers, obviously we're down one because we've lost Philip, but in terms of the numbers, there are enough numbers on the Conservative side to ensure that this goes through, as long as we have no problems on the opposition benches.
So that depends on the number of Labour rebels.
So from a Conservative perspective, I think we have enough to ensure that this goes through.
And so what that means is you will take control of the parliamentary agenda,
yes,
and then you will legislate to make Boris Johnson ask for a delay?
No. The bill is actually very, very moderate. It basically says to Boris Johnson that you can actually get us a deal by the 17th of October. You can then, if you fail to do that, you have to go for an extension. But if you want, you can even put a no-deal option to Parliament, and if Parliament agrees with you, then you can have your no deal. So it's a very moderate bill, but it's saying very categorically we're not crashing out without having a say in this House of Commons.
You have cut the legs from underneath him as far as this negotiation is concerned, haven't you?
Well,
I mean, between you, because Europe will say, well, he's lost his majority because Philip Lee has left, and his own MPs are going to force him to delay.
That is only an argument if you believe that this administration is engaging in any negotiation whatsoever. I have absolutely no confidence at all that nothing other than window dressing is going on as far as these negotiations are concerned.
So you think it's just a lie when they say that they're making progress?
I think there are papers, for example, apparently there's a paper, 29th of July, where very clearly the strategy of this new administration is highlighted as one of winding down the clock to a no-deal Brexit. That's the strategy. That's what they're aiming to do. That's why they're closing Parliament next week. That's why they're talking about having a general election, because they don't want a deal. They want to leave with an undemocratic no deal.
I mean, can we be blunt about this? I mean, are you saying the government is being dishonest in its claims today? To be negotiating, to have a plan and to be making progress?
I see, like Gitto, I don't see any evidence of it, and when the Prime Minister was asked repeatedly today, the answers did not come as to what were these concrete proposals that had been made to Brussels. They don't yet exist. And yes, it's part of the reason that I've walked here is that I'm just deeply concerned about the way in which this administration is going about its business. It's not something that I want to be associated with, and that's why I've joined the Liberal Democrats.
I mean, your Conservative Party career is over. Your Conservative Party career is effectively coming to a close quite soon. But I mean, I presume some of those people who are rebelling tonight would have wanted to stand as Conservative
Absolutely.
MPs at the next election.
Absolutely.
It is within Downing Street's gift now to expel them, isn't it?
Well, so Downing
despite
Street
what Philip Hammond said this morning.
And it's the incredible hypocrisy of a Prime Minister who happily voted against the previous Conservative administration, now having a different set of rules for his own administration. Yeah, exactly. And the incredible thing is that all of this came from an unelected advisor who's not even a member of the Conservative Party. But Boris Johnson appears to put more emphasis on Dominic Cummings than he does on the service of somebody like Nicholas Holmes to the Conservative Party. It really comes to something when the grandson of Winston Churchill is going to be thrown out of the Conservative Party. What have we become?
Gitto Philip Lee, thank you very much indeed. Well, as we've heard, the key to Boris Johnson succeeding in calling a snap election is likely to be the support of the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn has repeatedly called for a new election. Now one seems ever more likely. Will he back it? Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has just hot-footed it from the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting. What have you decided is your policy on a general election now?
Oh, we want a general election, of course we do. We want to stop the food banks. We need to do something about that. But It's a question of taking it in sequence. And the most important thing is, at the moment, is that we have to stop no deal because of the effect that it will have on people. We cannot afford to have a lack of medicines or not enough food or queues around the block. You know, this is what government's papers say will happen if we have no deal.
Because if what will happen tomorrow is you will have this bill, and you're confident of winning that.
Pretty confident, yeah.
But then does it automatically mean that it becomes law?
Well, it should automatically mean that it becomes law, but you know, look at this administration that we're dealing with. We have no idea. They say one thing, they do another, they tell lies, they seem to be more interested in chaos than anything else. As far as I understand, if a bill is passed, it ought to become law. Boris Johnson said a couple of days ago that he wasn't prepared to. Ministers said they weren't prepared to abide. Today they say that they are. Who knows? All we can do is do the right thing, and the right thing now is to stop no deal. We will pass this legislation, we will expect the government to abide by the rule of law, and therefore abide by this law that we will pass.
And so if you pass that law and then Boris Johnson says, OK, you've undermined me, we must now put this to the people, let's have a general election, will you vote for a general election under the existing Fixed Term Parliament Act, which enables him to set the date?
Exactly. So we have a government which says we need to prorogue Parliament. We need to get rid of Parliament. We need to get rid of Parliament for the longest period that we've got rid of Parliament for decades and decades. They say we need to get rid of Parliament in order to have a Queen's speech. They're lying. What they want to do is they want to get rid of Parliament. Boris Johnson has only been accountable to this Parliament for 2 days. And I tell you, if you were in the chamber today and listening to the way in which the Tories were reacting to the bluff and bluster that were coming out of this Prime Minister, he couldn't answer any questions. He was saying, oh, I'm sure I'll get a deal, and yet when asked for any details, couldn't give any details.
So will you vote for an election or not?
Well, so what we need to do is we absolutely need to protect the legislation that will ensure that we stop no deal. Let's get that in place first, and then we then take the next step, but we need to see what happens next.
So you can't say at this stage whether you will vote for an election or not?
We will vote for an election, but we will do it in our own terms and our own time, and not as a result of any provocation
can you force
from
him
Boris Johnson
to pick a particular date? Because there is this idea that you can do it through an amendment to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which forces him to pick a date and stick to it before no-deal Brexit.
I think that is very moot. Frankly,
you just don't know whether that's right.
Well, I've looked at personally. I've read the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and I think that the wording of the Fixed Term Parliament Act is fairly clear. That what you do is you get a 2/3 majority to vote for a general election. The Prime Minister can then pocket it and prorogue Parliament, which is what he's doing, gets rid of Parliament, and then he can kind of say, oh, well, you know, I did promise that I was going to do this date, but actually I'm going to have a general election on the 1st of November after we've bounced out of the European Union. We're not playing these games.
Okay.
We're not playing it.
Well, is there going to be a vote of no confidence this week then? Have you decided that?
No, we can't do a vote of no confidence because they're proroguing Parliament. If we do a vote of no confidence, it doesn't work unless 2 weeks later we're able to... And since he's getting rid of Parliament, do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you tell me I don't have any answers, but they're the ones who are backing us into a corner.
Okay, well, let's assume
so the
then...
one thing we are able to do, given the amount of time we have, is stop no deal, and that is our priority.
Well, let's assume for a moment that you get your legislation and you then all agree between you on a snap general election. What's Labour going to be campaigning for on Brexit?
No. Let's
Because it's going to be on October the 14th or so, isn't it?
Well,
You've only got 6 weeks to decide.
No. It's not necessarily going to be October the 14th at all.
It could well be.
No, because the problem is going to be we will need to have a guarantee from this Prime Minister and a guarantee that we can believe in, and we can't believe in this Prime Minister. That's my point. If we go and if we go and for 2/3 of us vote for a general election, we don't trust him as to when it is that he would have a general election. So that's why we need to clear the decks in terms of a no-deal Brexit. We need to be able to put that off until January, and then we can come back and look again at how we go about getting a general election. Because
so you don't think we're looking at a snap general election? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think we're in a position to have a snap general election. I don't think that we want that because we want to stop no deal first because that's our priority.
Emily Thornberry, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Oh, well, let's go now to John, who's just outside.
Thanks, Krishnan. Joining me now, Conservative MP Andrew Mitchell, who supports the Prime Minister. He voted against Mrs May's deal the first time it came before Parliament earlier this year, but was in favour on the 2 later attempts. Well, now, Andrew Mitchell, you've lost Dr Lee. He's defected to the Liberal Democrats, and you will now have no majority.
No, I'm very sorry to see him go,
But I think that the Prime Minister is absolutely right to grip this now and bring it to a head and to say that we are leaving on October the 31st, preferably with a deal, but we are leaving. I mean, look at the noise here, look at the deep, deep divisions, which must be greater than at any time in your and my political life. Look at the way Britain's international reputation has plunged through the floor. We've got to bring this matter to a conclusion, and that's why I'm sure the right thing to say is, look, we're leaving on October the 31st. We'd very much like to do so with a deal and work with our European partners to achieve that.
But you know exactly what's happened in your House today. What has happened has been a battle between a no-deal Brexit and the consideration of a deal. And the truth of the matter is that Mr. Boris Johnson has not made it clear that he will never go for no deal.
I think it's a battle over whether or not the announcement that we are leaving on October the 31st, preferably with a deal, but if we can't get a deal, we will leave with no deal, is believed by the European Union. And I think that is the position now. I think it's essential that it is the position, as I say, because of these incredible divisions that are dividing Britain, getting worse day by day.
Yeah, but some of those divisions are of your making. I mean, the behaviour today towards the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, who only 2 months ago was in office, today is threatened with being deselected altogether as a Conservative, and the same with the other 14 people. I mean, do you really support that sort of animal behaviour?
Well, when in the Maastricht Treaty, I was a government whip at that time of that very big, divisive European issue. We were defeated once on Maastricht, the Conservative government, and we reversed it the following day on a no-confidence debate. So I don't think it is unreasonable for Boris Johnson now to say, on behalf of the government, that we believe we will be completely undermined if this change in the legislation took place tomorrow, and therefore it is a matter of confidence.
You didn't threaten them with deselection.
Well, if they had lost the whip, they would not have been able to stand, and they did lose the whip, and had there been an election before we returned the whip to them, then they would not have been able to stand.
So certainly you should have been deselected the moment you voted against Mrs May's deal.
Well, I think that all members of Parliament should always.
Should you?
Well, there wasn't. It wasn't that.
Inconsistency.
No, it wasn't that. That wasn't the situation. The position then was not what it is today. We're right up against our limits now. We must try and, as I say, make sure that we leave on October 31st. But the difference is this: that I voted against her deal the first time round, because I thought that the government was not in doing the best thing for my constituents.
Yeah, but you didn't get deselected. That's the big thing. But I want to push you, though, because we have a situation in which Boris Johnson says that there are negotiations and the chances of coming out with a deal are improving, and that does not seem to be the case.
Well, I think if you look at the mood music of the G7, if you look at his meetings in Berlin, with Chancellor Merkel, in Paris, with
what are our
Macron.
new proposals? What are our new proposals? Have we made any?
Well, I'm sure that we have, actually, and it's clear from the letter that Boris Johnson sent to Donald Tusk that we are very focused indeed on alternatives to the backstop with Northern Ireland. But it's not surprising that these negotiations are not being. It's not surprising these negotiations are not being conducted in public.
But talking in Brussels to the teams there, they're all saying no new proposals will be made, particularly on the backstop.
Well, I'm not sure people involved in the negotiations are saying that.
Well, how many people are negotiating?
Well, we know.
Because we've talked to the negotiators here. The negotiating unit has been wound up.
Well, you haven't
Who's doing any negotiating?
You haven't talked to those who are negotiating on behalf of the British
Frost,
government.
But he's only there twice a week.
Well, twice a week with continuing negotiations, that's good enough for me. And I think that if we don't turn down the opportunity of saying we're going to leave on October the 31st, preferably with a deal, but we are going to leave, that is the best way of holding everyone's feet to the fire to try and ensure that we get a deal. I think that the alternative is one which is going to do very grave damage to our democratic system. We must, in my view now, bring this matter to a head, say that we are going to leave on the 31st of October, and do everything we can to get a deal in the interim.
Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. The Prime Minister says his threat of a no-deal departure helps strengthen our negotiating position with the EU. Our Europe editor, Matt Fry, is in Brussels. Matt, the view there?
Well, John, it's fascinating listening to Andrew Mitchell there because, frankly, the message that we've had from everyone we've spoken to in Brussels today, at the Commission, in the European Parliament, is that they are dumbfounded by the optimism coming out of number 10. First of all, that there is a progress, that there are negotiations going on and they've achieved something. They're all telling me the same thing. They were virtually
no talks. There was literally radio silence, the big nada between the two sides until the G7 summit. And only since then had there been some technical talks, but not substantive negotiations. And only in the last few days has the senior negotiator for the UK side, David Frost, actually turned up here in Brussels. We've also been told by other sources that that team that was 90 strong is now down to a quarter of its size. So they are really questioning here how serious the government is when it says it wants to renegotiate this deal, and whether they're just, on a completely different planet when it comes to their assessment of the reality. I spoke to two senior people here today. One is the First Vice President of the European Parliament and the Europe Minister of Finland. And by the way, Finland, of course, holds the rotating presidency of the European Council, and that makes them rather important at the moment. Listen. I mean, what's the level of engagement, as far as you know?
Well, as far as I know, there's talks. But I suppose, let me put it this way, you and I are talking. We're not negotiating, but you might describe it as a negotiation if you wished. But it wouldn't be the truth. If you're negotiating, you come with something. You come to the table with a real clear proposal to meet what we need to achieve in the withdrawal agreement. What I figure is happening is that there is a sense in which Boris Johnson talks the talk and makes very strong statements, very passionate statements, in the belief that words will deliver the result that he thinks he wants. But the truth is otherwise.
We will, of course, stick to the withdrawal agreement, and the backstop is an integral part of the withdrawal agreement. If alternative, really compatible alternative choices can be presented, we will certainly explore them, but so far there's none on my table.
So far there are none on your table?
No, so far no.
That was the Finnish Europe Minister. What they really want to see here are kind of new developments, and they've not had anything from London. By the way, we also understand that the European team, the British team rather, is not going to put anything new forward on the table in case that might be rejected by the European side. Now just imagine that, a negotiation in which you're not prepared to put your first position on the table because you're afraid it might get rejected. That is absurd, but that's where we are at the moment. And one other thing, here they are completely prepared for no deal. They assume that it will be a no-deal Brexit. They've thrown an awful lot of money at preparations for that, so that threat in itself doesn't work anymore, quite frankly. And also, if there is a no deal and we pull out without paying the money that we owe the European Union, what do you think that will do to any future trading negotiations? It will leave an awful lot of bad blood after a terrible divorce, and they won't even start those talks until most of that money has been paid. That's it from Brussels. Back to you, Krish.
Thanks, Matt. Well, Jeremy Corbyn has just been speaking in the debate in the chamber right here. Let's hear what he's had to say.
Voting to block no deal will not kill the positive momentum in Brexit negotiations, because there is no momentum in the Brexit negotiations to kill. What we're asking MPs today to do is rule out playing Russian roulette with this country's future.
Well, if a general election does take place in October, or as Emily Thornberry suggested, after that, Boris Johnson's chances of winning a majority will hinge regardless, in large part, on the number of votes his party loses to Nigel Farage's Brexit party. Well, Mr Farage is speaking at a party rally in Lincoln tonight, and Jane Death is there for us. Jane.
Not one of us have said that. Yes, this is the latest stop on the Brexit Party conference tour. Or should that be election rally? Nigel Farage will be on stage in a couple of minutes, and he'll be talking to one of the most Eurosceptic parts of the country. Areas of Lincolnshire voted by more than 70% to leave the EU. And in this hall, they go even further. They believe no deal is the best deal. Well, today I asked Nigel Farage whether he's prepared to do some kind of pact if there's a general election with the Prime Minister to get Brexit over the line. He said if Boris Johnson were to call a general election to get a parliamentary majority for a new deal with the EU, then he will fight him in every seat. But there is a scenario in which he would work with the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party to maximise the Leave vote.
If he decides that actually the only way
Brexit can really be delivered is to go for a clean break on the 31st of October. Well, then we want to support him, help him in every way, have a non-aggression pact with him. And you know something? With his strength and our strength combined, we'd be unstoppable and he'd win a very big parliamentary majority.
He also believes that in many Labour-held seats, if there was an election and, if you like, you pooled the Conservative and Brexit Party votes, you could unseat Labour in many areas. And also he hinted strongly that he may stand as a candidate if there were an election. When I asked him where, he said, well, that would be to be announced.
Thank you, Jane, very much. Well, now Boris Johnson has made it a cornerstone of his premiership that he is prepared to leave the EU without a deal. But what impact could that have? A major new report released today by King's College London brings together what government modelling and its own analysis predict could happen in the immediate aftermath as well as the weeks ahead. The number of lorries with the correct paperwork to enable them to cross the channel could halve within a day, whilst disruption to imports mean there could be a shortage of some fresh foods, fruit, vegetables and poultry within a fortnight. Direct rule of Northern Ireland could be reimposed and 40,000 jobs would be put at risk as a consequence of no deal. And the government predicts that a no-deal Brexit would reduce the UK's growth by 8% over the next 15 years, compared with staying in the European Union. The report concludes the impact of a no-deal Brexit will be significant, damaging and long-lasting. Well, joining us now is the lead author of the report, Professor Anand Menon, and who's from King's College London, and John Mills, businessman, former chairman of Vote Leave. Professor Menon, what enables you to give such specific figures? I mean, to say 15 years is a very specific number.
Well, the specific figure we give, about 8% over 15 years, is from the government's own estimate, so we quote them as such. So what we're saying is, we think that ultimately the clearest evidence of the economic damage of no deal is over the long term, because over the short to medium term it's relatively hard to know what precisely happens, who puts controls at when, what level tariffs might be that we impose. Over the longer term, what we're clear about is, all things being equal, and that's an important rider, our GDP will be smaller than it would have been had we stayed in the European Union. Now, that doesn't mean that other things won't intervene, changes to productivity, government policies here that can help our GDP, but we're just saying, looking at that one single thing, making trade significantly harder with your nearest and largest trading partner is going to have a negative impact.
John Mills, would you go so far as to say that leaving without a deal is not a good idea, according to these figures?
Well, I think we're in a rock and a hard place. I don't think we've got any easy options now. And I think the government's strategy of saying that they'd be prepared to contemplate a no deal to get something better does make some sense. Now, whether that strategy is going to work, whether it's going to come to fruition, I think it remains to be seen. And I think the situation is wobbling at the moment, so it's not certain that it will.
Now, do you suspect the professor has gone off the edge, or is he right in the heart of it there?
Well, I think that there's an enormous question about what assumptions you use to produce the results. I mean, for example, saying what's going to happen in 15 years' time is really, I think, very, very sort of risky.
What about lorries with paperwork? That seems pretty obvious that you know, the likelihood of everybody having the right paperwork and the rest of it the day after we leave is very small indeed.
But that's something that is under the British government's control. And what HMRC have said very clearly is what they'll do is to give priority to getting the goods through, getting the lorries moving, rather than getting hung up on paperwork. And this must be the most sensible thing to do.
Have you factored that in? Or?
Well, let me say three things. Firstly, on the forecasts themselves, we're very, very careful in the report to hedge what we say by saying, look, these are forecasts, they're not predictions. All sorts of other intervening things can happen in the next 15 years. We're not saying what the British economy will look like. We're saying that basically the impact of not being in the single market in the customs union will be deleterious to around that effect. On the trucks, it's absolutely true, as John says, that the British government has made a clear decision to prioritise flow over revenue. That is to say, we're going to keep things moving, even if it means we're not collecting the full tariff. The EU, and there's two sides to every border, has not said that. And that's the issue, is that whatever the British government does, for our things to move across that border, and indeed for our things to come back in over that border, the EU have got to play ball too. And what they've said very, very clearly is we will be imposing the checks and the tariffs. The tariffs are less important than the checks in many ways from day one. If they can actually do that, it will have an immediate effect. But bear in mind, I'll just say one more thing. There's a lot of contingency here. The 1st of November is a public holiday in France. So that lorries are not allowed on public motorways in France on the 1st of November. So no one's expecting Armageddon on the first day. What we're saying, though, is that as these things kick in, there will be an impact.
Well, I mean, that does sound pretty irrefutable.
Well, I'm not sure it is. I mean, first of all, I don't think it... I've had years and years of experience of export paperwork, and it's not that difficult to do it. I'm sure some of the lorries that turn up won't have the paperwork in exactly the form it should be, and I understand they're going to be shunted on one side, while all the ones who have got the paperwork
But this is only
right
if
go
there's
through.
no deal. If there is a deal, then presumably there'll be all sorts of things like that will be sorted out. This is surely a document which actually deals with the question of no deal.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think Anna's absolutely right in saying that if there's no deal and tariffs are imposed straight away, that is going to cause some problems and hiccups. I think the issue is...
So as a businessman, you might perhaps say to Boris Johnson, don't do it.
Well, I think nobody really wants no deal at all. Right across the spectrum, nobody wants no deal. What I do think the problem is if you're not prepared to walk away from a really bad deal, you finish up with one that's even worse. That's the dilemma we're facing.
Well, John Mills, Professor Adam Oden, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, we won't know for sure exactly who's voted against the government until later this evening, but sitting among the rebels is the former Immigration Minister, Caroline Noakes. She said yesterday that preventing a no deal that may threaten the livelihoods of her constituents means a great deal more to her than keeping the Conservative whip. But what do her constituents make of that, with threats of deselection from on high hanging in the air? Our Home Affairs correspondent, Andy Davis, has been to Hampshire to find out.
About Brexit, I expect, do you?
About Brexit, yes, and more specifically, the stance taken by the local Tory MP in this part of Hampshire, Caroline Noakes. One of the Tory rebels, so-called, in Downing Street this morning, threatening to defy the government tonight to try to prevent a no-deal Brexit, which in turn could see her having the party whip withdrawn.
Yeah, I wouldn't want her to lose. She's been good for the area. You know, she's very proactive, so I wouldn't want her to lose her job over it now.
So is she doing the right thing?
It's a difficult one. I'm not with her 100% on that. I mean, I understand she wants to put her constituents first, but a lot of people have voted for her to, you know, take us out of Europe, and that seems to be quite important to a lot of people. So I don't know.
We're in Stockbridge, part of the Romsey and Southampton North constituency, a safe Tory seat which voted Remain. And Caroline Noakes, you're fully behind her?
Absolutely.
I think she ought to back what Mr Johnson is trying to do, is to leave Europe.
Crucially, what does Caroline Noakes' local Conservative association make of this standoff? One which could see her ultimately deselected as the Tory candidate in a future election. David Drew is a deputy chairman of the constituency association. How would you feel if it came to the whip ultimately being withdrawn from Caroline Noakes?
I'd be hugely disappointed because she's a hard-working member of Parliament, and the association would be hugely disappointed. And I think residents would feel disappointed that someone who'd made voted on a principle was being punished.
Is your support for Caroline Noakes here shared by others in your association, or are you a fairly unique voice?
No, I think the association is very supportive of the hard work that Caroline does.
Could you try to stop a deselection process?
I would imagine at this stage I would be looking, subject to what happens in the next few days, looking to encourage a change of mind, a change of heart. Because I don't think that for constituencies where the Liberal Democrats are snapping at the heels of the Conservatives, there is going to be much chance of retaining that seat unless we have a Member of Parliament who has an excellent track record and who reflects the broad view of the electorate in that constituency.
Caroline Noakes said yesterday the jobs of her constituents meant more to her than keeping the Conservative whip. Her almost decade-long tenure here as a Tory MP, as with others tonight, hangs in the balance.
Welcome back to Westminster, where later this evening rebel Tory MPs and opposition parties will try to unite to seize control of the parliamentary agenda to head off a no-deal Brexit at the end of October. I'm joined now by Catherine Haddon from the Institute for Government. Now, Catherine Haddon, thank you very much for joining us for a start. But how do you see the legalities, the constitutional legalities of what's going on? Have we left the planet as far as the Constitution is concerned?
Well, we're certainly in completely uncharted territory as far as what Parliament's doing, what the government's trying to stop happening, and in terms of what happens next. I keep getting asked, what will happen next? It's very difficult to know, because we're outside of the rule book at the moment. In terms of what the Commons are doing right now, they're completely innovating. This is unheard of in terms of using an emergency debate in this way, but they feel that they've been driven to that position by what the government's been trying to do.
Well, now, people have been talking about a coup. I mean, these crowds have been shouting, "Stop the coup." What exactly are the people who are trying to stop Brexit trying to do tonight in the House of Commons and over the next 2 days?
Well, this has all come about because back in the spring there were mechanisms for Parliament. They had multiple votes that the government had given them, that Parliament actually fought to get, where they could come back and say if they were happy or not happy with the course of events. That's all spent, so you don't have those mechanisms now. So this is Parliament trying to ensure that some exist. From the government's point of view, because all of that's passed, therefore this is the policy of the government and they should continue with it. And the Parliament doesn't at this stage have the right to have that say. Parliament thinks that it does.
Well, then of course there's another constitutional issue, and that is that you need 2/3 of the Parliament to vote for this thing.
Yeah.
Is he going to get it?
It looks not likely at the moment unless this extension bill gets through, and obviously the government don't want that, so you've got a standoff between opposition and government. But there are other ways that certainly Boris Johnson can try and get an election. He can just do a very short bill that sets aside the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. He only needs a small majority for that. But that could be amended. So that in itself could then be hijacked. From the opposition's point of view, if the numbers are there, they could just amend this bill that's going through tomorrow and have that say that there should also be a general election and what day it is. So it really is then a battle of legislation.
What's your informed guess in a few words?
It feels like it's going to pass tonight, but things could look very different tomorrow night.
Professor Haddon, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, let's go back to Krishnan in the House of Commons for the latest on what is actually going on there.
Thanks, John. Well, the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, has just insisted that today's attempt by MPs to take control of the parliamentary agenda is legitimate after it was challenged by prominent Tory Brexiteer Peter Bone. The Speaker said he was exercising his judgment correctly. Here's what he had to say.
I have done it, I am doing it, and I will do it to the best of my ability, without fear or favour. To coin a phrase, come what may, do or die.
Well, for the government, the leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has just been attacking the Tory rebels' plan to delay a no-deal departure from the EU.
Instead of backing the Prime Minister and giving him the best possible chance of securing a deal before the UK leaves the European Union on the 31st of October, we find ourselves debating a proposition that seeks to confound the referendum result again.
And our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me now. Gary.
What is happening in there at the moment is, as you gauge from that riposte from the Speaker, absolutely unprecedented. It's nothing like it has been tried before. We're in extraordinary circumstances tonight, and they could get more extraordinary, because if this bill passes, the booking time for it, if the whole process kicks off tonight and a bill passes, Boris Johnson is determined to try and call an early general election. What we don't know at the moment, the real puzzling thing talking to people at the moment, is that it sounds as though Jeremy Corbyn, and you've heard this when he's been talking in public, is minded to go for that early general election. And amongst Labour MPs I've been talking to, instinctively I sense about 2/3 of them aren't. And they're wondering whether Jeremy Corbyn's going to try and, if this all happens tonight and Boris Johnson moves trying to get an early general election, whether Jeremy Corbyn's going to try and put some sort of conditions on that general election, but effectively go for it and allow the whole thing to kick off. That's one of the great tussles that's going on in the background tonight as people look at these extraordinary events unfolding in there. I think one of my other takeaways from today is trying to gauge who are the unhappiest people in that chamber at the moment. And it's a close-run thing between the rebels, who feel they're about to be potentially thrown out of the Tory party, and the people who think like them, who are going to go through the lobbies with Boris Johnson. And there are quite a lot of those people there. And one of them said to me earlier, I think it's fair to say, really quite shaken and not looking on top of things, I just can't take it anymore. These people are exhausted by the pressure they've been under. It's not like they feel there's another great big political project out there for them. They've just run out of space, run out of road, and I have to say that is one of the most sort of clinically depressed places I've seen in a very long time, that building next to us at the moment, that chamber. An awful lot of people in the opposition in a quandary and in the Conservative Party ranks just wondering whether they're in the right place.
Sounds straightforward, but remember it's deeply unusual for backbenchers to grab control of what gets discussed in there, however much support they might have outside. But when the moment came...
It has become an urgent matter for Parliament to discuss, in particular for this House to discuss, whether it can accept a no-deal exit.
The Speaker put the question.
Does the right honourable gentleman have the leave of the House?
Then watch a clump of Tories stand to rebel. Opposition MPs applauding. Forces joining together to provoke this controversial debate. Tories who vote against the Prime Minister have been told it will cost them their job.
If he thinks that the device of withdrawing the whip this evening is going to change my mind or that of my honourable and right honourable friends, he has got another thing coming.
What times we live in, I will be voting for this motion.
But is the government that bothered? This could be a splintering of the Tory party, with a blistering invitation to the rebels from one who'd already quit.
I have no regrets. To those brave souls on the Conservative benches who face expulsion from the party for voting for the motion today, I say this: your country needs you.
For the government, even this vote taking place tonight risks a delay to Brexit. The one thing the Prime Minister's vowed he'd never do. The one thing his ministers would fight with all they have.
We find ourselves debating a proposition that seeks to confound the referendum result again. Mr. Speaker, I wish to be clear. What is proposed today is constitutionally irregular. We all have a role to play, and it does considerable damage when some of us choose to subvert rather than reinforce, to hinder rather than to polish our Constitution.
I fear that if we go down the path that is being suggested tonight, we will be opening up a chasm of distrust between Parliament and the British people. It is something that will play only into the hands of the political fringes, and that is something we will all come to regret.
The lines of this clash were drawn the moment Boris Johnson moved into number 10. But this profound conflict between Parliament and the Prime Minister can't be settled with both sides content.
So here we are, live inside the chamber of the House of Commons tonight. It's a packed chamber for this very crucial vote. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg inside the Houses of Parliament watching these images with us.
Order.
The ayes to the right, 328. The noes to the left, 301.
Not a good start, Boris.
Order. The ayes to the right, 328. The noes to the left, 301. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock.
Another Burko fix. Order. Brexit process, a milestone.
A big milestone, Hugh.
One of the front benches want to speak to the Prime Minister.
The consequences of this vote tonight, it means that Parliament is on the brink of wrecking any deal that we might be able to strike in Brussels, because tomorrow's bill
would hand control of the negotiations to the EU, and that would mean more dither, more delay and more confusion. And it would mean that the EU themselves would be able to decide how long to keep this country in the EU. And since I refuse to go along with that plan, we are going to have to make a choice, Mr. Speaker. I don't want an election. The public don't want an election. I don't believe the right honourable gentleman wants an election. But if the House votes for this bill tomorrow, the public will have to choose who goes to Brussels on October the 17th to sort this out and take this country forward. Everybody knows that if the right honourable gentleman is the Prime Minister, he will go to Brussels and beg for an extension. He will accept, you will accept whatever Brussels demands, and we will have years more arguments over Brexit. And by contrast, Mr. Speaker, everyone knows that if this government is in charge and if I go to Brussels, I will go for a deal, and I believe I will get a deal. And we will leave anyway. Even if we don't, we will leave anyway on October the 31st. The people of this country will have to choose, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has been begging for an election for 2 years. He has crowds of supporters outside calling for an election. I don't want an election, but if MPs vote tomorrow to stop negotiations and to compel another pointless delay to Brexit, potentially for years, then that would be the only way to resolve this. And I can confirm that we are tonight tabling a motion under the Fixed Term Parliament Act.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I welcome tonight's vote. We live in a parliamentary democracy. We do not have a presidency, but a Prime Minister. Prime Ministers govern with the consent of the House of Commons, representing the people in whom the sovereignty rests. There is no consent. There is no consent in this House to leave the European Union without a deal. There is no majority for no deal in the country. As I've said before, if the Prime Minister has the confidence in his Brexit policy, when he has one he can put forward, he should put it before the people in a public vote. And so, he wants to table a motion for a general election. Fine. Get the bill through first in order to take no deal off the table.
Order. Point order. Order. Very rude for members. Order. 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 I say to the Chancellor of the Duchy that when he turns up at our children's school as a parent, he's a very well-behaved fellow. He wouldn't dare behave like that in front of Colin Hall.
Well, riotous scenes and uproar in the House of Commons. A very, very dramatic few moments, and with good reason, Hugh. Real drama there in the House of Commons tonight. MPs have voted, defeating Boris Johnson quite significantly with a majority of more than 20 votes. They will, in the next few days, try to change the law to rule out the possibility of ever leaving the European Union without a deal. This is an audacious and a very unusual move for the opposition and backbenchers, Tory backbenchers, to join together to try to block the Prime Minister from ever having that possibility. But Boris Johnson's riposte, very clear. He says if MPs manage to change the law in what he sees as a way that would create another pointless delay to Brexit, he will lay tomorrow a move in Parliament to try to force a general election on October the 15th. And in his answer, Jeremy Corbyn said, well, not yet, but a suggestion there, a very heavy suggestion, that if MPs are successful in blocking no deal and changing the law in the next few days, then after that, Labour may well agree to Mr Johnson's request to go to the country. Nothing is certain. There are still lots of hoops to jump through. The House of Lords is one question. There are plenty of things that could go wrong or right, depending which side of the argument you are on. But clearly tonight, MPs, by voting in this way, have taken the country a step much closer to another general election, another major question being put to the public and put to all of us very soon.
Laura, let's just recap a moment for those who are just joining us here on BBC News at 10, because we've had this very significant vote in the House of Commons in the past few minutes. Let's have a look at the figures once again, because the tellers, when they declared them, were giving 328 for this motion, which allows MPs to take control of parliamentary business, and as Laura was saying, a pretty hefty majority in terms of this Parliament of 27 over the government on 301. And no disguising the anger on the government front benches, certainly from the Prime Minister. And then Mr Corbyn himself, of course, responding. And Laura, I think the question for lots of people now is, how will this work out in parliamentary terms if you have MPs on the one hand trying to get control, as they have done now, of parliamentary business, trying to get this bill through, and at the same time the Prime Minister trying to enact the terms of the Fixed-Term Parliament Act to get an election date? How are those two processes going to work in tandem?
Well, the question, Hugh, is very open as to whether or not they manage to work in tandem at all. The answer to that may well be a really tangled mess over the next few days, because fundamentally what we have here is a Prime Minister who will do almost anything, it seems, to stick to the promise that got him into number 10, which was to leave the European Union whatever happens at his Halloween deadline, and a Parliament under its current iteration that is pretty much dead set against ever leaving without a deal. So Boris Johnson can threaten a general election. He and his team have made it absolutely plain that if MPs vote to change the law in the next few days and are successful in doing that, they will try with vigour, determination and perhaps a lot of bullying as well to get an election to happen. But if there are MPs who just are too suspicious of them, well, he may fall well short of getting a 2/3 majority that he's meant to be able to get in the House of Commons to allow election to go ahead. But my understanding is if they don't manage to get a 2/3 majority, they would simply come back with a different version, a different motion to put to MPs, which they believe they would be able to get through with one vote. Just one vote in the end could see us head towards another general election. I have to say, though, and I think it's important for all of our viewers to understand, all of this is really uncharted waters, not just because the way that Brexit has sort of rewired and reshaped our political system, but also because the area of law that now governs all of this is the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, which you mentioned, which was only brought in a few years ago under the coalition and has never been tested before in this way. It's never been put under this kind of strain. And therefore, the outcomes, I'm afraid to say, if you're looking for stability, don't ask me to predict anything with an enormous amount of certainty tonight. But as we were saying just 24 hours ago, the conflict between the Prime Minister and Parliament is so profound. Before too long, this conflict is going to have to be resolved one way or another, and it's very likely, whether it's in 6 weeks or a couple of months, that that may well mean all of us being asked to answer it, because this place has simply just not been able to find agreement amongst itself.
Well, we'll talk again later. Thank you very much.
Sure, joining me now, the constitutional expert, Professor Meg Russell, and alongside Professor Russell, Alistair Campbell, who is Tony Blair's Director of Communications, of course. Thanks both for joining us on an extraordinary sort of febrile night. Alistair Campbell, if I can come to you first. It's interesting, isn't it? Boris Johnson was straight in there saying that he's going to table a motion for a general election. Andrea Leadsom says he's calling Jeremy Corbyn's bluff.
Well, I think Boris Johnson, I mean, he's lied the whole way through this. He's wanted no deal and he's wanted an election from the word go. And I think it's very sensible what Jeremy Corbyn has done today. He's not falling into the trap. I also, campaigning for the People's Vote, welcome the fact that he was so clear and unequivocal in saying to Johnson, the only way we're going to resolve this, if he had really believed in his plan, is to put it before the country in a referendum. Added to which, there is no negotiation going on. This idea there's some detailed deal that's being negotiated in Brussels, it is a myth and a fantasy.
Yes, but whatever negotiation is going on, surely the Prime Minister at this point has a point when he looks to what has happened there in the Commons tonight and said, you've taken away the legs from under my negotiating position. The EU will now look at Parliament and think, well, we know where the power is.
I don't know, but that suggests that they're sort of stupid. Look, when they were dealing with Theresa May, there were detailed discussions going on day in and day out. It's not happening. They know that Johnson is trying to play a game. So, look, I think what's happened tonight is really significant. I'm very, very pleased that it's happened. I hope that he loses again tomorrow, and I hope that the Labour Party and the other opposition parties hold firm, because the fact is, what he's trying to do is he worries that he would lose a referendum on Brexit, so he's trying to muddle it up in a general election with the split opposition parties. He can get a mandate for no deal by getting 30% of the vote. That is not the way to behave on an issue as serious as this.
Professor Russell, what do you make of the strategy which seems to have emerged within the last few minutes when we've been standing here?
Well, I have to say I find it very strange. I found that a bizarre threat on the part of the Prime Minister, who seems to be saying to MPs that if you don't do it my way, I'm going to force a general election. But what he seems to have missed is that actually under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, it's MPs who get to decide whether they want a general election. He can't. We used to have a situation where Prime Ministers could call the shots in this. Since 2011, that hasn't been the case. He will have to put a motion down, and it will need to be supported by 2/3 of all MPs in the House of Commons. So even if Labour simply abstains, that resolution won't go through. So in a sense, Labour's strategy could be to trap him in office, answering questions on the floor of the House of Commons, answering these difficult questions about no deal and his negotiating strategy, and deny him the election that he's demanding. So it's a strange threat.
But what does that look like to the wider world, and Boris Johnson's point that he is trying to execute the will of the people as expressed in the referendum?
Well, I think you have to look at it in the context of the clock ticking down towards the Brexit day. We've just had a 5-week recess. As you've mentioned, this is only Boris Johnson's second day on the floor of the House of Commons, and it's not been a good day for him. He's just made this announcement, which we have condemned. I was a signatory to a letter in the Times today, signed by a lot of senior constitutional experts, saying that the prorogation that he's proposed is improper, that he's denying the House of Commons the opportunity to scrutinise his Brexit strategy, and in effect a general election would do the same. We'd have a 5-week break for an election when he was not under scrutiny, not being asked questions, and presumably not doing very much negotiating because he'd be out on the road. So actually I think what we need is scrutiny. We need the House of Commons to be holding the government to account.
What do you think the strategy should be for Labour now? I mean, you're slightly detached from them now since you were booted out, Alistair Campbell.
Look, I really, really care about what happens in this debate. I will support Jeremy Corbyn if he is clear that he's not going to play Boris Johnson's game, he's not going to dance to his tune, and that at some stage there's an understanding in that place that the only way this is going to get resolved, the only way that these people are going to come together around a vision of the future of Britain is if this issue is resolved on its own terms in a referendum. And I also think in a general election when it comes, there's going to be massive tactical voting. They want Jeremy Corbyn to be the issue. I think the issue in this election is going to be Boris Johnson's fitness to be Prime Minister.
Alistair Campbell, Professor Meg Russell, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening and following all the twists and turns as we've seen them emerge in the last few moments.
Well, let's go straight to Nick Watt, who's watched those votes come in, who's in central lobby for us. Take us through those numbers, Nick. Pretty much what was expected?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, slightly higher than expected. There were, Boris Johnson was getting some people on his side, but as you say, that's a very heavy defeat. Let us not forget, in his first outing as Prime Minister, and as we were saying there, it is estimated there were 21 Conservative rebels, 2 former Chancellors there. They will now be stripped of the Conservative whip. I was talking to one former minister who actually supported Boris Johnson and said, look, it's just not sustainable. You cannot take the whip away from that many MPs, from those senior figures, and really run a credible government. As you also saw there, Boris Johnson announced, as we expected, that immediately he's tabling this motion to have a vote tomorrow under the Fixed Term Parliament Act to have an election if 2/3 of MPs vote for that. Crucially, he's going to have that vote if the rebel bill to stop a no-deal Brexit by the 31st of October. He'll have the vote after that if he loses again. And the big question then was, what will Jeremy Corbyn do? He said, fine, I'd love to have an election, but he said, you've got to get the bill through first. He didn't specify actually what that meant, but that does suggest that this bill's got to be on the statute book. It's got to have royal assent. So in other words, Labour wouldn't necessarily be voting for that early election tomorrow night. But I spoke to one very senior member of the Shadow Cabinet and I said, you know, so what is your party doing? And this member of the Shadow Cabinet said, well, it beats me if I know what Jeremy Corbyn's tactics are. This person said the leadership's office really has been all over the place on this one. They want to have an election. They want to show that they're in favour of an election, but they're very concerned that Boris Johnson could move the date around and that he could allow a no-deal Brexit.
So if that bill goes through tomorrow, Nick, is there any way it can then be scuppered or delayed in the Lords past the week that prorogation begins?
Well, the opposition is tabling a business motion to allow this bill to go through the House of Lords over 2 days. Pro-government peers have tabled 92 amendments just to that business motion. Now, in the House of Lords, the opposition figures are saying, look, we can beat them. If they're going to be tough, we're going to be really tough. We have the numbers because, of course, the government does not have a majority in the House of Lords. But the government is absolutely determined to use every procedural device they can to block this bill in the House of Lords. And the point about the House of Lords is nobody controls the time. The convention is that you don't, as they say, guillotine, you don't bring things to a halt. But what you have is opposition peers saying these are unprecedented times, talking about the prorogation of Parliament. Boris Johnson and his government can play dirty, will play dirty too. They're talking about going through the night, they're talking about going through the weekend, they're talking about even just going continuously through to next week, which would mean that the Thursday sitting would still be taking place on Monday, and that would raise questions about whether Parliament could be prorogued. One senior figure in the House of Lords said to me, maybe we need to smell them out.
Nick, let's take some of those points to our guests now. We did ask the government to join us tonight. Nobody was available, but instead we can talk to Mark Harper, former Conservative Chief Whip who voted with the government. We've got Ken Clarke, the father of the House, Nicholas Soames, the grandson of Winston Churchill, who voted with the Tory rebels and hopes to fight the next election. Ken Clarke is stepping down. But Mark Harper, we're going to start with you tonight. Somebody called out there, not a good start, Boris. He's been in power as PM 40 days. Yep. Nobody's lost a vote this early since 1894, and this was critical. This is a bad defeat.
Well, look, the thing I'm most disappointed about with my Conservative colleagues is I want them to give Boris Johnson a chance to do what he said he wants to do, which is to go to the European Council and come back with a deal that we can get through Parliament. The former Prime Minister couldn't get her deal through. I think we need two things to get a deal. He's got to show he can leave without one, but he's also got to show he can get it through Parliament. And I think we've got to bring the Conservative Party together, but we've also got to be able to say to Labour MPs, vote for the deal that the Prime Minister brings back, or it's no deal, because nothing else is going to get them in our division lobby.
Hang on a sec. You're talking as if the script hasn't changed tonight.
No, I agree. So
that's
why I'm disappointed, because I think that we should give the Prime Minister the chance to go to the European Council, make the argument, and bring back a deal. If he doesn't bring one back, okay, then those people that are very worried about no deal have some options in front of them. They could do them, but taking the moves they've done today, I think, is very premature, and it cuts off his legs, his negotiating hand, and it means the EU, as far as I can see, if the bill is passed tomorrow, the EU has no incentive to make any changes at all.
Right.
And then,
so that's
okay.
Let's talk about the gentleman next to you.
And then we'll never leave the European Union.
You have two grandees from your own party here, who, as of tonight, are rebels, part of that rump of rebel alliance, and they will be deselected by your party.
Well, look, I think what the Prime Minister said today, which I welcome, is that he thinks that this European issue is a confidence matter, and he's going to apply the same level of discipline to both sides of the argument.
You've got the father of the House and the grandson of Winston Churchill, who are being asked to leave the Conservative Party.
What I would say,
who's been voting regularly against plotting against his predecessor for months.
What I would say to Ken and Nick is the Prime Minister made it clear today in answer to a question that if he brings back a deal, he will apply the same level of discipline to those colleagues who don't vote for that deal. So if you're
Let's
a Conservative
cross that one when we
MP,
come to
well,
it.
no, but I think it's really important. He's being even-handed here. He's saying to both sides of the argument, this is an important matter.
Let's cross that one when he comes back with a deal from the EU.
He's saying don't
right
tie
now,
his hands
these two gents
and get
want
a
to
deal
know
through.
whether they can still call themselves Conservatives, have the party whip, and whether Nicola Soames can stand in his own seat at your next election.
What I would hope is that, obviously, they voted the way they have this evening. What I would hope is that tomorrow, when the bill is before the House, that they step back from that and they let the Prime Minister have the opportunity to try and come back with a deal.
You think I'm going to vote against the bill tomorrow?
Well, no, I'm just saying, I would hope
This is a silly
you
footnote
did.
issue. I'm not standing in the next list
you know,
anyway. I announced that a long time ago. I'm as amused as Michael Heseltine is by being told he's not a Conservative because he voted against the party in the House of Lords. This is all based on this absurd argument that Boris is trying to get a deal. He's obviously not trying to get a deal. I'm sure he'd prefer one if he thought he could get one past his right-wing supporters, but he's dug himself in. He assumes he's going to get no deal. He knows there's no
majority. Will argue because of the way people like you voted tonight.
No, it's because he assumes he gets no deal because he can't get the right wing of the Conservative Party, many of them now stuck in his cabinet, to agree to it. Well, he voted in favour of Theresa May's deal. I voted for Brexit.
Do you
I'm not
still
trying
feel
to
like
reverse
a Conservative
Brexit
tonight?
Of course I'm a Conservative. I'm a mainstream Conservative.
Do you recognise your party tonight?
No, it's been taken over by a rather knockabout sort of character who's got this bizarre crash-it-through philosophy in charge. A lot of people, a cabinet which is the most right-wing cabinet any Conservative party's ever produced, they're not in control of events. Mark's doing his best, but the Prime Minister comes and talks total rubbish to us.
Why do you believe him? Why do you believe him when he says he has
to hold
a
a quick election and get out, blaming Parliament and Europe for the shambles?
Look, I think the EU would prefer us to leave with a deal, and I think Boris would prefer, the Prime Minister would prefer us to leave with a deal, and I think that's what he has an opportunity to do. But if this bill is passed tomorrow, and effectively it's saying that he has to ask for an extension if he doesn't get a deal and has to agree to whatever the EU offers, whatever conditions are attached. Well, that's what the bill tomorrow
It's more
says.
complicated than that, Emily.
We're never going to get a deal, and we're never going to
the
leave.
last 2 days, and I'm in no doubt that he wants a deal and that he thinks, I'm quite sure he wants a deal, but what he wants is unachievable. And it's not possible, it's not on offer, and he won't get the deal he wants. And I believe that this is all slightly played into his hands tonight, as Ken says. And I think they planned, personally, all along, to have an early general election and to get this out of the way and get a new parliament.
Have you been tapped on the shoulder? Have you been
I have been
texted
told by the Chief Whip, who is my friend and who I like very much, but he has told me that it will be his sad duty to write to me tomorrow to tell me that I've had the whip removed. After 37 years as a Conservative Member of Parliament, I've voted against the government 3 times in 37 years, and I've had the whip removed. You know, that's fortunes of war. I knew what I was doing, but I just believe that they're not playing straight with us, in that to say you want a deal is quite different from saying you want a deal that is achievable.
So,
and what he wants is not achievable.
What will you do then at the next election? If an election is called imminently, will you stand? Will you stand as an independent Conservative?
I actually won't stand. I'm not going to stand.
So he's losing both of you?
No, but
yes,
Ken was going to go anyway, but I
was going to go anyway. I first announced I was going to retire in 2015. I put it off once already.
Yes,
but I'd have to decide whether to vote Conservative if Boris Johnson's still the leader. That's my next problem. I am a Conservative, of course I am. But my kind of Conservative, and I've been a mainstream Conservative for 60 years, you know, I'm part of the establishment, I think I could claim the Conservative Party.
You're part of the elite.
A large part of my career. And anybody who comes out to me and tells me I'm not a Conservative is plainly, you know, taking an odd political view. But I don't recognise
phrase, the one nation Tory.
And this leader, I don't recognise.
This is now one dogma.
It's a Brexit Party rebadged.
Look, Emily, on all other issues, right, I don't think there's probably much of a difference between any of us, including, by the way, Boris Johnson.
Well, there is, because you are putting yourself on a side.
Because all the other issues that Boris Johnson's been talking about during the summer, I don't suspect that Ken or Nick would disagree with any of them. On Europe, there is a difference of opinion. And Nick's agreed that the Prime Minister does want a deal. I perhaps disagree. I think actually there is a chance of getting the Europeans to move, but they need to believe that if they move, we can get whatever deal they give us through Parliament. And for that to be true, I think the Conservative Party needs to come together and back the Prime Minister, at least give him the chance to make that argument at the European Council. And I think we also need to be able to confront Labour MPs. Labour keeps saying it doesn't want no deal, but it had 3 opportunities to vote for a deal and didn't. I think we've got to confront them with a choice.
Well, from the Prime Minister's
that we haven't confronted them with so far.
He is getting rid of dead wood that is holding him back from achieving what he wants. I mean, that is how this will be seen.
Well, he's going to find it quite difficult in the next few days. He's lost Philip Lee, so he's lost his majority, and he's now going to lose 6 more. He's going to lose the Father of the House, 2 former Chancellors, 8 Privy Councillors. You know, it's not a sensible way to run a government, really.
If you take away, you, as in the Conservative, the governments now, take away the whip from the 21 rebel Tories, you are left with 294. Now, the SNP, Labour and the Lib Dems, the Greens, make up 297. Doesn't that seem the craziest maths you will ever enter into just before an election?
Well, look, I think on the European issue, I don't think whether people have the whip or not is going to change the arithmetic, because
no, wait a second. It is if they're going to be deselected and they're not allowed to stand.
Clearly people today voted in light of knowing what was going to happen. So I think the real issue tomorrow is just saying to people, look, just think about what you're doing. You made the point that Boris Johnson hasn't been Prime Minister for very long.
Honestly, with the greatest respect, you're not going to say to people, think about what you're doing tomorrow when you've seen how they voted today. They're not suddenly going to have a Damascene conversion overnight.
No one is going to peel away from tonight's result.
Well, no, but the point I would make is there are 17 Labour MPs who've tabled amendments for tomorrow. It's entirely possible that if those amendments are not carried, they've made it quite clear, those 17 Labour MPs, they do not want infinite extensions and this process never to be resolved. And I think there's an argument to be made that we need to bring this to a close, to get out of the European Union.
Nothing is brought
and
to a close.
Negotiate that future
Nothing
relationship,
is brought to
not
a
keep
close.
going on forever.
Nothing is brought to
and
a
that's
close.
what this bill does.
What these gentlemen have chosen is an extension which doesn't bring it to a close, and no deal doesn't end anything. It is just the absence of a deal. It's like a teenager slamming their bedroom door. It doesn't get you out of the bedroom.
Well, it gets you out of the European Union, which is what people that voted Brexit. Well, and then you start the process of negotiating the future relationship
with no leverage. With no leverage.
Well, I think there's
lost any negotiating power you have.
Positive argument to be made about Britain's place in Europe, because we're not leaving Europe, we're leaving the European Union, about all that we bring to Europe in terms of the size of our economy, the role we play in European security.
They might not have their arms open after all this.
Well, look, I do think there's a positive argument to be made there. I think the Prime Minister started making that argument when he met with the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany, and I hope that sort of diplomatic engagement
Nicholas
continues.
Soames, a last thought to you. Is this the night that we saw the end of the Conservative Party as your grandfather will have known it, as you will have known it?
No, but it's a bad night. It is a bad night, and it's a pity, in my view, a great pity, that this is, in my view, all been planned. I think it's been planned. I think this is exactly what they wanted. I think they've got it, and they're going to announce tomorrow they're going to table the necessary legislation to try and organise to have a general election. And I think that's what they wanted.
Thank you very much indeed.